In 2015, I decided to conquer the Appalachians. My friends bailed at the last minute, but I was full of confidence. I had experience. I taught navigation and orienteering for a nonprofit organization. I thought a solo hike would be a good challenge. The morning started off beautifully. The sky was clear, and I set a good pace. By midday, I had ventured deep into the mountains, enjoying the solitude and the splendor of nature. I felt prepared and in control of the situation. However, by evening, clouds began to gather, and the wind picked up. I quickened my pace, hoping to reach my destination before the storm hit. Soon, the approaching storm caught me off guard. Snow began to fall heavily, and before long, I could barely see a few feet ahead. The trail vanished under a thick blanket of snow, and I realized I was in trouble. The wind howled around me, making it difficult to navigate. I found shelter behind a rock outcropping, wrapping myself in an emergency blanket to retain body heat. Hours passed, and I shivered uncontrollably. Thoughts of those freezing on Everest filled my mind, and I wondered if I would meet the same fate. Finally, the storm began to subside, and a few stars peeked through the clouds, allowing me to determine my direction. My compass had fallen off somewhere along the trail, adding to my panic. Consulting my map, I realized I had strayed from the path. It was too dangerous to hike at night, especially alone on snowy trails. I decided to build a snow cave to survive until morning. Using my trowel, I scraped out a space in the snow, making 2 breathing holes and positioning the entrance perpendicular to the wind. Inside, I laid out my sleeping bag and then my emergency blanket on top. At first, it was very cold, but over time, the walls of the cave warmed slightly from my body heat, creating a relatively comfortable space. The night was long and cold, but the cave did its job. When morning came, the wind had blown away some of the powdery snow. I crawled out of my shelter, feeling stiff but alive. I managed to find the trail again and decided to head back to my car. Instead of completing the planned route, I didn't want to push my luck any further. The hike back was uneventful, but my thoughts raced with the events of the past day and night. I didn't find my compass, but I made it to my car safely. As I sat in the warm vehicle, I realized how close I had come to disaster. My survival skills had kept me safe, but I also learned an important lesson: never hike alone. This experience in the Appalachians left a deep mark on my soul. It reinforced my understanding of the importance of preparation and respect for nature's unpredictability. I knew I would continue hiking, but I would always try to have a companion by my side. Safety in numbers wasn't just a saying, it was a necessity. A few months later, I set off again to conquer a new trail. The morning was clear, the air crisp, and the path inviting. I was ready for a new challenge, and this time I knew you can't rely completely on nature. It's essential to be prepared and attentive. Story number 2. This story happened a few years ago when I decided to go on a camping trip with friends to some abandoned places rumored to be haunted. We prepared for a long time, studying the route, gathering tents and food. But at that moment, as we left the city, none of us could have imagined what awaited us. On the first night, we set up camp by a river. The sun was already setting, and the forest was filled with strange sounds. We sat around the campfire, discussing local legends about spirits that supposedly roamed these areas. Soon we fell asleep, but I was awakened by some rustling noise. At first, I thought it was just the wind, but the sound grew louder, as if something was getting closer. I got up and, taking a flashlight, stepped out of the tent. The forest around was dark and silent. I tried to see something in the darkness, but I saw no one. Returning to the tent, I shared my concerns with my friends, but they just laughed and called me a coward. The next morning, we decided to hike up the nearest mountain. The climb was tough, but we enjoyed the breathtaking view at the top. We took several photos and began our descent. Suddenly, one of my friends, Max, stopped and pointed to something in the bushes. We moved closer and discovered an old, overgrown trail leading deeper into the woods. At that moment, it struck us this could be the abandoned site that locals talked about. We decided to explore the trail. It was narrow and wound between the trees. Gradually, the forest became denser, and a strange smell of decay filled the air. We pressed on, and the further we went, the more I felt a sense of unease. Suddenly, there was a crack ahead, and a wild boar burst out of the bushes. We panicked and scattered, but eventually regrouped and realized we were lost. Our phones had no signal, and the map we had brought was useless. We began to yell for each other, but soon noticed that it had become eerily quiet. The sounds of the forest had vanished, and it was frightening. We decided to turn back to the trail, but it was gone. Each step we took felt increasingly hopeless. Finally, we stumbled upon an old cabin. It looked abandoned, but strange symbols were carved on the door, as if someone had tried to ward something off. We hesitated, but eventually decided to go inside in search of shelter. Inside, it was dark and damp, and the air smelled musty. Suddenly, one of us noticed old things in the corner: rusty tools, dirty clothes, and even some strange figurines. We began examining them when we heard noise outside the door. We froze in fear, and then heard a soft but distinct voice calling our names. Panic overtook us, and we bolted out of the cabin. The forest around was just as silent as before. We understood we were becoming more lost. Running between the trees, we started calling each other, but soon realized that each of us was alone, face to face with this horror. Every rustle became more sinister, and the shadows around seemed alive. After several hours of wandering, I managed to find my friend Sergei. We decided that we needed to find our way back to the river and return to camp, hoping that maybe the others were waiting for us there. When we reached the river, it started to rain, and the forest filled with the sound of raindrops. But amid that sound, we heard the same voice again. It was calling us, and this time it sounded closer. I was ready to see one of our friends, but only a shadow appeared in the darkness. We decided we had to go back to the cabin, hoping the others had found shelter there. When we arrived, we saw that the doors were open. Inside, it was empty, no signs of anyone. My heart raced, and at that moment, I realized this was not just an abandoned cabin. Something terrible had happened here. We quickly left that place, hoping to escape the forest before whatever had been lurking there caught up with us. Finally, we managed to find the trail, and soon we saw the familiar outlines of our camp. But when we returned, there were no tents, no traces of our friends. Everything was gone, as if they had never existed. Since then, I can't shake the feeling that the forest holds its secrets, and that we had gone too far that time. Story number 3. In a small town where everyone knew each other, there stood an abandoned park. It had once been full of life. Children laughed and played on the swings, while adults strolled along well-kept paths. But over the years, the park became forgotten, its greenery overtaken by weeds, and the old attractions rusted away. Only a few dared to approach its gates, believing that something sinister lurked in its shady alleys. One autumn day, a group of teenagers led by Jake decided to explore the park. Jake was the bravest among them, and his friend Amy always supported him. The others, Sam and Kate, were initially hesitant, but soon their curiosity got the better of them. The next morning, they gathered at the park entrance. The wind rustled fallen leaves, and the sky was overcast, threatening rain. The friends ventured inside, feeling a sense of unease. The abandoned attraction stood like ghosts of the past, their once bright colors faded with time. As they walked along the winding paths, they stumbled upon an old carousel, once adorned with bright lights. It creaked gently in the breeze, as if some invisible force was setting it in motion. Jake decided to ride it, provoking disapproving glances from his friends, but his excitement outweighed his fear. When he mounted one of the horses, the carousel suddenly began to spin faster. Jake tried to get off, but his legs felt glued to the seat. Music filled the air, the same tunes that had once played in the park. The others, alarmed, rushed toward him, but soon realized that the carousel had become their trap. It spun faster and faster, and before long, Jake and the horses began to disappear, as if being swallowed by the carousel itself. Amy, Sam, and Kate stepped back in horror, and at that moment they saw a figure emerging from the trees. It was an old clown in tattered clothes, his face hidden beneath makeup, and his eyes gleamed with maniacal glee. He slowly approached them, pointing at the carousel. "Join the fun," he sang menacingly. "We have plenty of room for new friends." Panicked, the friends turned to flee. The sound of the clown's laughter drowned out their footsteps. They ran through the underbrush, not daring to look back. At some point, they felt they were breaking free from the chase and finally burst out of the park. Gasping for breath, they stopped at the roadside. The park looked completely ordinary, as if nothing had happened. No clown, no vanished friends. They exchanged uneasy glances. But Jake, who had just experienced something inexplicable, was certain they should never return to that park. From that day on, it remained forgotten, while the old park quietly waited for its next victims, luring them in with laughter and music from a distant past. In the friends' memories, that encounter forever lingered as a mysterious nightmare, and they never forgot what lay hidden behind its abandoned walls. Story number 4. On the edge of a small town, surrounded by dense forests, lived a young man named Alex. Since childhood, he had loved nature and often escaped into the woods to explore uncharted paths and enjoy the silence. After his girlfriend left him, he decided that spending time alone in the forest would be the best way to distract himself from his bitter thoughts. One early morning, as the sun began to rise over the horizon, Alex packed a backpack with essentials, water, snacks, and a compass. He headed towards one of his favorite woods, where he had once found a small waterfall hidden from view. This forest was known for its mystical stories and rumors of strange creatures, but Alex had never believed in fairy tales. After several hours of wandering through winding paths, he finally reached the waterfall. Water cascaded from a height, creating a white veil of mist. Alex sat on a rock, enjoying the sight and sounds of nature. However, soon his attention was drawn to something strange. From behind the trees came a quiet, persistent sound, reminiscent of a sob. Curious by nature, Alex decided to investigate. He cautiously moved towards the sound, pushing through the bushes. When he got closer, his heart froze. In a small clearing sat a woman, her face hidden beneath long hair. She stared blankly at the ground, and when Alex asked a question, she lifted her head. "Help me," she whispered. "They won't leave me alone." Filled with fear and curiosity, Alex stepped closer. The woman looked lost, as if she had been there for a long time and was suffering. But something in her eyes made him feel uncomfortable. He remembered the stories about how some people never return from this forest. "Who?" he asked, trying to understand what she meant. "They," she said, pointing into the dark corner of the clearing. "They are watching me." At that moment, something rustled in the bushes. Alex felt a chill run down his spine. He turned to leave, but for a moment caught sight of something white slipping between the trees. His instincts told him to run, and without a second thought, he turned around. He stumbled over a tree root falling to the ground. When he got up, dread washed over him. The woman had vanished. He remembered her words about being followed, and now he found himself in a trap. Alex bolted in the opposite direction, trying not to look back, but he could hear rustling and quiet footsteps behind him. The escape felt endless, but soon he recognized a familiar trail. He ran as fast as he could until he saw his car parked at the forest entrance. Sighing with relief, he jumped in and glanced in the rearview mirror. No one was there, but the feeling of being pursued lingered. Returning to town, Alex realized he would never be able to explain what had happened. He avoided the forest for months, but thoughts of the woman and the mysterious shadows haunted him. Every time he heard rustling in the trees, he felt they were calling him back. It wasn't until a year later that he dared to return, this time bringing a friend with him. Together they headed to the waterfall, hoping the forest would no longer be so frightening. When they reached the clearing, they discovered that nothing remained. No woman, no strange sounds. All that was left were the silent trees, which seemed even more somber and mysterious than before. Alex sighed with relief, but deep down he knew the forest held its secrets, and he would never forget what had happened in its shadows. Story number 5. I've always loved hiking. Fall is my favorite time of year when the leaves change color and the air turns crisp. I invited a few friends, and we decided to spend the weekend in a remote forest where, according to rumors, ghosts lived. This place had always drawn me in, and I was ready for an adventure. We set up camp on the edge of a clearing, lit a fire, and started sharing scary stories. Laughing and joking, we didn't notice how darkness enveloped the woods. Suddenly, I noticed one of my friends, Tony, acting strangely. He kept glancing into the trees as if he saw something there. "Hey guys, don't you feel like something's off here?" he said. We just laughed it off, but his words sent a shiver down my spine. That night, when everyone fell asleep, I decided to step out for a smoke. The forest was full of rustling sounds, but one noise made me freeze. It sounded like someone was walking through the leaves, and then, suddenly, I heard a soft whisper come back. I turned around but saw no one. Trying to calm myself, I went back to the tent, but sleep eluded me. Drowsiness hit me, and I had a dream. I was standing in the same spot where we set up camp, but everything was different. The sky was overcast, and the forest seemed to hum with anxious whispers. I felt something pulling at me, but I woke up screaming. In the morning, when I stepped out of the tent, I realized Tony was missing. We started searching for him, but the tracks were strange, as if someone had dragged him into the woods. I was starting to panic, but my friends tried to calm me down. We split into groups, and I went with Mary, who also sensed that something was wrong. Hours passed, and the air was thick with fear. We stumbled upon an old cabin that the locals talked about. As we got closer, I noticed the door was ajar. Mary suggested going inside, but I was against it. I recalled the whisper from my nightmare and realized we shouldn't be there. But curiosity got the better of us, and we stepped inside. It was dark and damp. In the corner stood an old trunk, and on it lay a photograph. It was us. But Tony was missing, and in his place was a dark figure with empty eyes. We immediately rushed outside, and at that moment I heard a horrifying scream. It was Tony's voice. He was calling us from the woods. I felt my heart drop. We sprinted toward the sound, but soon realized the forest had changed. Every path seemed unfamiliar. I heard the whisper again come back. We found ourselves back at the spot where we had lit the fire. Suddenly, we noticed a semicircle of figures around us. They were ghosts. They were silent, but their eyes looked at us, filled with a hungry longing. I felt myself being pulled, as if something wanted to take me. I broke free and ran away in panic, but Mary was nowhere to be seen. I screamed her name, but the forest swallowed my voice. Eventually, I stumbled onto a path and, gasping for breath, ran toward the car. I didn't look back. When I reached the road, the forest behind me fell silent, as if nothing had happened. I never found out what happened to Tony and Mary. Now, every time I hear the whispers of the wind, I remember that forest. I will never go hiking again. The woods hold their secrets, and perhaps they're waiting for their next victim.